All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Alan. Hey, I want to make a quick comment. At some point, I don't remember exactly when I did this, but I referenced a debate between a Christian apologist and an atheist. I think the atheist's name is Billy Carter or Bobby Carter or something like that. But and a guy named Wes Huff, who's an apologist, and they debated each other. And it's, I think in the process, I told someone, or maybe even I said from up here, that I wasn't like blown away by Wes Huff's performance, not because he didn't do a good job, but because his opponent was just so woefully unprepared that it's kind of like, I don't know, Andre the Giant wrestling a 3-year-old. It was so ugly. It was like, well, Andre's not trying very hard. So I just want to encourage you, by the way, so I now have listened to the entire debate or discussion between Wes Huff and Joe Rogan. We're going to be talking about it on the Reconstructed Faith podcast coming up. And I was really super impressed with Wes Huff in his areas of expertise, in his awareness of where he is an expert and where he isn't. Like, I would now highly recommend him to anybody. He was able to if you can tolerate Rogan's language and flippancy, it's an interesting listen to hear Rogan ask his questions, his big, broad, general questions, sweeping questions, and then to hear Wes Huff gently, charismatically, kindly, and I would say very efficiently dismantle and disentangle every question that Rogan has in such a way that by the end it's laying on the ground in shreds. And so I was super impressed with that. So in case I communicated, and maybe I did, a lack of being impressed with Wes Huff, understand that was because I had only seen him going up against a child, and so relative speaking. And so it really did a great job, and I would highly recommend him. Okay, so having said that, and we're jumping back into Luke chapter 20, wrapping up 20 today, and then moving on into 21. And we've just watched Jesus engage over this chapter and a little bit of last chapter, scribes and priests and then Sadducees. He's made his way to Jerusalem for the last week before his crucifixion. That's what's going on here. As is often the case in the Gospels, Roman and Greek biographies aren't written like American or Western biographies, modern ones at least, in which we start with their birth and we kind of equally divide out their life until the point of their death. Biographies written at that time, their focus was, hey, don't pay any attention to stuff that doesn't matter. And so focus all your attention on the stuff that matters most. And what you see in the Gospels typically is that almost half the Gospel is spent during the last week of Jesus' life. Partially because this is when the disciples were starting to even vaguely understand what Jesus has been talking about all this time. And so they're starting to put pieces together, but we're also seeing him clarify some of his claims. So this chapter 20 started letting us know that the action of this chapter are taking place in the temple, probably in the men's section of the temple, where you would expect the rabbis and Sadducees and Pharisees and scribes and chief priests to spend most of their time, especially debating someone like Jesus. We'll see that change by the beginning of the next chapter, but still, that's where he is here. So far, it has been battle after theological battle with the religious leaders, and he has silenced them. He has done so over and over again now with, of course, a combination of his wit, his reason, and, of course, his flawless and divine understanding of Scripture. One of the things that's interesting is you see in this passage, we see that his passion is very clear. He has a deep and sincere love for the truth. I really appreciate, once again, catching up on the Chosen series, and one of the things Ginger pointed out when we were watching it recently is it's so easy for us to picture Jesus as kind of passionless, as not having a passion in the way that he communicates. And in the show, they show very clearly, like he's angry with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, with how they've misled the people of Israel, how they have destroyed the religious significance of the law, how they've mishandled this. And so you see his passion expressed in that. And I don't know if it's because we have a whole generation now of us that were raised with like flannel graph or like still pictures in our little Sunday school paperbacks or whatever. But, Jesus doesn't move in a flannel graph. He just has this one, like, he's just standing like this. And then we read the passage and it gives us almost this impression of Jesus as this kind of passionless, motionless person, which I don't believe is at all accurate. And so we've seen his passion come out. He has a heart for the humans that he created in the image of God. He has a great love for people taking his promises seriously and knowing why he makes them. He wants this to be the most significant thing in our lives. He knows that we need it to be the most significant thing in our lives. And finally, his call that has been all through the book of Luke and is even more clear here, his call for us to be totally his, to live as totally his. There's not something we get to hold back. We're not half his, we're not 95% his, we are all his. Everything that we would go, oh, I don't want to submit that, or I don't want to submit that, or I don't want to submit that he goes, well, I'm sorry about that, but it's mine. And our job is to step forward and say, okay, it's all yours, I'm devoted fully. Now watch today how today's passage reinforces this idea yet again. We're going to see a couple of paradigms laid out for us, a couple of ways for us to engage with following Christ and living life. And they're going to be shown to us today. So I'd like to take 1 second before I dive into that part of the passage. I want to take a step backwards into chapter 20. There was a section that kind of got, was left on the kind of cutting room floor of sermon writing. But I realized I really do want to bring it back because I think it's an interesting point for us to help us connect who Jesus is in all of this. So I'm going to step back a couple of verses to chapter 20, verse 37. And note this significance. So this is, we talked through this last time, but that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush, where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. Now he is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for all live in him. Jesus is ending the conversation here about the resurrection. He is putting an emphasis, no, this is the way it works. And I mentioned to you that there's kind of a snarky edge, it feels to me, this little bit about that passage about the bush. Remember, he's talking to Sadducees, and the Sadducees are the classically trained. These are the PhDs in Bible trivia. They know every bit of this. They are the ones the Pharisees are largely kind of self-trained, creating all their own schools. The scribes are studying it all the time, but the Sadducees are the ones who went to college and went to seminary and went to whatever, and they're now the most prepared. And I do think Jesus is being snarky when he's like, hey, there's this passage, maybe you've heard of it, it's got a bush in it. And I think he's intentionally I don't know if you guys have read this passage. Maybe you missed this passage, is the point he's making. Now, here's the passage he's referring to, though. It's found in Exodus chapter 3. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6. Now, Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, right off the beginning, you see that there's the angel of the Lord that appears to him. So many people, myself included, believe that the angel of the Lord is typically not merely an angel, but is in fact Jesus Christ. It's the second person of the Trinity before his official incarnation, that this is Jesus. There's a few reasons why we think this, and I'm not going to unpack all of them. A couple of them include the fact that after the incarnation, we never experienced the angel of the Lord again. He doesn't show back up for any messages at all, even in Revelation. However, more importantly is the fact that the messages that the angel of the Lord deliver are often inappropriate for a mere angel. This is one of those times. And by the way, you'll notice already within just those 6 verses, the angel of the Lord and God are used interchangeably. In this case, listen to the message that he continues with. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So here, this fascinating picture, not the message of a mere angel. The passage even refers to the angel of the Lord as God now by this point, clearly. So in other words, this, I believe, is Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, having a conversation with Moses through a burning bush. And now in one of the most important moments in human history, He is not only introducing himself to Moses and giving Moses a call, but he's introducing himself to Moses and giving Moses his name. Before this point, as far as we know, people only knew God's title. And here now we get his name, Yahweh, I am. It's an incredible picture, and it has all kinds of significance that we're not going to unpack this morning. I just want you to see that Jesus clarified and solidified the doctrine of the resurrection, but where he chose to anchor it in Hebrew Scripture, anchors it to the very character, name, and identity of God himself, and in fact, is actually probably Jesus referencing himself in this conversation. So in other words, why you have, when we study the book of John, you'll remember there are several times in the book of John when Jesus says something and he references himself as I am the bread of life, I am the living water. You get these expressions of himself, and he uses this I am phrase. Of course, the one at the end where the guards come to him and say, are you Jesus? And he says, I am, and they all fall down. And you can imagine Jesus being like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to put those two words together in y'all's presence like that. That's going to be me. Or something like any other version of the Jesus speaking, I am. One of the most ignorant arguments that sometimes you hear from people is people who claim that Jesus never claimed to be God in the Gospels, which is ignorant. Jesus does not in English say the phrase, I am God, for several reasons, one of which is he doesn't speak English. But most importantly, what Jesus says in his place in the Jewish world is, before Abraham was, I am. And that is an absolutely clear connecting himself to the great I am. That's me. I am the I am. And here's what's wild. The people who were listening to him knew exactly the point he was making, because they then decided to kill him for claiming to be God. If he wasn't claiming to be God, they really badly misunderstood him, and that whole crucifixion thing was a big mistake. I don't think that's the case. I think he was claiming that. And so what that means is the foundation, freedom, redemption, and the future resurrection of God's people has always been about him. From the very beginning, he literally anchors here the end of the argument on the resurrection in himself in Exodus chapter 3. So at this point, it feels like the conversation is over. He has now humiliated the Sadducees as well with his words. But then one of the scribes, Luke 20:39, then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him any questions. I think the picture here is of the scribes who have been just embarrassed a few minutes before, and now they have watched their opponents, the Sadducees, be embarrassed, and they kind of scoot over nearer to Jesus. They take a few steps. Now they're like, yeah, this guy's he's really smart. He's kind of one of us. And this is a mistake. Jesus is now going to need to clarify this, that he's not one of them. And that's what he's about to do in just a second. But this is a powerful picture. You have spoken so well, because they still see themselves in the position of the evaluator. Oh yes, we give Jesus a B+, maybe an A-. Good job. And this triggers Jesus into keep talking. We've seen this before several times when it seems like Jesus is done, and then someone is foolish enough to open their mouth. That's what happens here. They're trying to embarrass. Jesus has some more points to make, and he's going to make it clear that he has some things to say to the scribes. But first, the first thing he says is going to probably be confusing to most of us. I think this is what's happening. Jesus is now, what feels like a non sequitur, Jesus is about to answer the question that he thinks they should be asking. The question they should be asking is something like this. Who are you? Are you the Messiah? What does that mean? Are you the Son of God? What does that mean? Are you the divine Son of Man? What does that mean? They should now be in the role of student. They're not. They're still in the role of master in their minds. They're evaluating him. So Jesus is going to is going to begin to unpack something in just a few sentences that's going to probably really rattle them. So Luke 20:41, he says this. Again, this question seems totally out of the blue to us. But he said to them, how can they say that the Christ is David's son? So here his question to them. Jesus knows the debate that's happening about him. Who is he and what is he? They're not asking it. They should be asking it, so he's going to answer something important about this for them. Jesus wants to make clear to them that they are behind the eight ball. They don't understand yet what's going on. He is the Messiah, but he is not merely the Messiah. The Messiah is not merely the Messiah. The Messiah is more than a rabbi. He's more than a man. This is the term they keep using for him, is rabbi, teacher. And he says, no, it's more than that. It's even more than Messiah, anointed one, chosen one. It's even more than that. Jesus wants to show them this. He knows this is not what they think. The religious leaders are not overjoyed that Jesus claims to be the Messiah. But they are very agitated that he keeps claiming to be God's special son and the divine Son of Man. Now, the question is, are they wrong to think that the Messiah is going to be a descendant of David? They are not. Jeremiah 23, 5 and 6 says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely, and this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord is our righteousness." However, Jesus wants to point something out to them. So, though he is a descendant of David, he is not inferior to David. He's not lesser than David. His kingdom is not dependent on David. In fact, I'll tell you what, I'll just let Jesus make the argument here. Luke 20, verse 42, "For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' David thus calls him Lord, so how is he his son?" Here Jesus is quoting the 110th Psalm written by David. In this psalm, David references two characters who are speaking to one another. One of those characters he calls the Lord. The other character he calls my Lord. Thus, David is calling one his own Lord in addition to the Lord. In the psalm, the Lord is inviting my Lord to sit at his right hand, the seat of ultimate honor. Both the Lord and my Lord in this verse are David's lords. King David is referring to both of them as his Lord, the Lord, my Lord, and they're speaking to each other. This should be super confusing. So Jesus reasons, how could David's Lord also be David's son? How could David's Lord also be David's inferior? That doesn't make any sense. And Jesus is pointing that out from the Psalms. This is how he asked it. David thus calls him Lord, so how is he his son? Here's the conclusion Jesus wants them to reach. By the way, this is easy for us intellectually because especially if you're raised in church, this is kind of our presupposition. Right, Chris, Jesus is Lord. Good, thank you. Move along. We all know this. But remember, these are the Jewish scribes. These are the Sadducees and the teachers of the law. Their entire identity is based on this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. This is their whole identity. And now Jesus is pointing out a passage in their own scriptures in which you have the Lord and my Lord being spoken by David. How is this possible? You don't normally do that. You don't walk into your king and say, my Lord, let me introduce you to my Lord. That's going to create friction. Well, who's Lord? They both are. And so David thus doing that, the conclusion, the Messiah is somehow not just a descendant of David, but superior to David. The Messiah is someone to whom David would refer to as his Lord. Greater than David. Someone David would call my Lord. Well, then who is the Messiah? He's not merely a descendant, but he's someone special. Again, it's easy for us. Here's what I'm trying to imagine the scholars doing though. So, right, Jesus brings this. I don't know if any of you have this issue. So I'm imagining the scribes either responding, they're going to respond one of two ways. Either they're going to go, man, I've always wondered about that, but I've been afraid to ask, right? I'm going to get in trouble if I ask about Psalm 110. We don't talk about Psalm 110. You've probably felt this. There are probably questions you have in Scripture. You read through something and you're like, who is Cain afraid of? Better not ask that one. I might get in trouble if I ask that. There's a question, you've run across questions, and you either see them and you go, we're just going to pretend like pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. We're just going to move right along, right? Or we somehow miss it. How many of you in the last few years, you read Unseen Realms or you started reading the Bible Project, and that was the first time when they referenced that in Psalm 82, there's this divine council made up of little g gods, and they make that claim, and you're like, You pulled out your Bible like, that can't, no way. No way. Oh, there it is. Somehow, all the times I've read the Psalms, I missed that. Just skimmed right over. So either I picture the scribes either going, I've always wondered about that, but I knew not to ask, don't ask. Or they thought, it does not say that, and they pulled out their scrolls and what do you know? Right there it is. Either way, they're called out. Jesus has pointed out a hole in their theology. The Messiah is not merely a descendant of the throne of David. Well, then what kingdom is he king of? It's not just the kingdom of David, it is the kingdom of heaven. It's not just the kingdom of Judah and Israel, it is the kingdom of God. This goes back to our conversation. For us, it's our hope to be excellent students of our rabbi, but he's not merely our rabbi. We want to be good followers of the Messiah, but he's not only the Messiah. This is the one to whom we go for everything, for the completion of our very identity. You'll appreciate when I was 19 and a student minister, which is when I had to grow facial hair, because I actually had a 19-year-old in my student ministry. And so the people couldn't tell who was the student for a lot of reasons, who was the student, who was the student minister. And so I tried my first week, I decided to teach, I'm going to teach spiritual gifts, because that was something my pastor had taught recently. And I thought, the students will love this. I was wrong. They didn't get a bit of it. And so there I was in Crockett, Texas with about 20, 30 kids, and I'm trying to teach spiritual gifts, and about 30 minutes in, I realized I've lost all of them. They're not paying any attention. There was no devices. If there had been, they'd have all been on them. They were just kind of zoned out, counting tiles in the ceiling, which is the way we did it when I was a kid, by the way. None of these phones. We had to count things. And so I was like, guys, I can tell I've lost all of you. I'm so sorry. Here's what let's do. Next week, come in with questions, and I will answer your questions, or I will make up an answer, or I'll research the answer until you run out of questions. And when I left 4 years later, they had not run out of questions. We were still every Wednesday night doing questions and discussing them, and just, I don't know, I'll look that one up, or whatever. The very first question the next week, this is the kind of thing I mean, the very first question, a girl goes, why do we sing those stupid songs on Sunday morning? And I was like, well, let's just come out swinging, right? I mean, let's don't hold back. No, really, don't hold back. Let's go. People have questions like that, and I think that's tough for us. I hope you will understand that if Jesus is not only the Messiah and not only the rabbi, but is also the divine Son of God, he's not afraid of our questions. That's something that, once again, the scribes have missed this. Verse 45, and in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, so they're still standing there, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats of synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. So much for the scribes thinking he's on their side, huh? Remember 5 minutes ago when they were complimenting him on his good answers? This one doesn't draw the same response from them. Isn't it easy for us, by the way, here we are 2,000 years later, isn't it easy for us to give special honor to the people who have trappings of success and significance? Isn't it funny how we still do that? What are the signs of wise and godly people? It's got to be people who wear nice clothes, people who have wealth and significance in the community. That must let us know who is godly. If not, maybe it's the ones that everyone knows them and everyone wants to be known by them, that everyone greets them and goes out of their way to greet them, especially in a public setting so that everybody can see that you're greeting them publicly so that everybody can know you know them on a first-name basis. That must be who is wise, those people. Or maybe it's the people who get the best seats, the positions of honor, the special guests. Maybe those are the ones who are godly and wise. Surely at minimum, it's those who have long, impressive public prayers. Surely that's got to be it. The ones who have a lot of outward religiosity, that's got to be it. Those have got to be the ones, right? Well, here's the surprise answer. Sometimes. I mean, absolutely, sometimes. Sometimes. There's nothing wrong with any of those things in and of themselves. Sometimes it is the wealthy who are wise and godly. Sometimes it is the significant that are wise and godly. Sometimes. But what we know is that those outward external trappings are not trustworthy signs of a godly, wise person. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes those qualities are there as an expression of godliness and wisdom. A lot of times those qualities are there because those people really, really honor those qualities in themselves. At the same time, some of those people who have those things, as Jesus said, quote, devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. And listen to this. They will receive the greater condemnation. God's not entertained by our externals that are not internal. God's not humored by that. He doesn't think it's cute or it's funny when we put on a show so that people will respect us just because we like when people respect us. Now, this language is really troubling, isn't it? I don't know about you, but this is one of those that I would like to skim over, like we talked about a minute ago, is the phrase greater condemnation. What is that? That's tough. This makes sense from a justice perspective. That's not what I mean. So I'm a little bit of a, obviously I like words a lot, and I'm not a Greek scholar, and I'm going to make sure I'm not doing this out of order. Yeah, I think I want to do this here. The language in the condemnation is not a kind of merely verdict. It's not even a kind of kind of the process. So for example, in James 3, the half-brother of Jesus says this, not everyone should be teachers because teachers will be judged more harshly. Well, that language, that word means the process of judgment. The evaluation will be harsher on teachers than for people who aren't teachers. This is not that word. This word is the conclusion will be harder. The condemnation will be greater. The verdict, and most importantly, the sentencing will be greater. Well, do we struggle with this in our theology? At least I do. So in God's name, they take advantage of the most vulnerable, and they know better. They know the law. They're literally students of the law. So Jesus is saying, listen, not only they have no excuse, literally I can take probably their own writings and therefore condemn them with their own writings and their own teachings. He has no patience for this. Remember how Luke 12 made it clear that the master who knows, the servant who knows the master's will but doesn't do it is in much more trouble than the servant who doesn't know and doesn't do it. So what does it mean to face a greater condemnation? Keep in mind, Jesus has also said that the judgment would be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon, even Sodom and Gomorrah, than many of the Jewish cities. It's impossible to be certain, but here's where I kind of land. And Jesus does not unpack this much for us, so we have to be patient. But it seems likely that through all the destruction of hell and damnation and condemnation, as awful as all of those is for anyone who would reject God and His free gift of salvation, there may be degrees even of the wrath that He pours out there under those circumstances. We're not given a lot of information here, but there are just too many references to the idea that like in heaven, there being rewards or crowns or certain victories and successes that are celebrated in heaven, so that though all who pass into heaven experience the glory of the Lord forever, there are also kind of bonus points that you can experience there, which you should be motivated by. Jesus regularly tries to motivate us, encourage us in that. At the same time, it seems that even those who fail, who face the wrath of God as being rebels against Him, that there are levels of consequence there. I don't know exactly what they are. The Bible does not unpack it. There may be extra torments in hell. That is certainly God's prerogative. Our prerogative is to accept the free gift of grace that He offers us and avoid it entirely, which is what we're called to. And I think that's part of why there's not a whole lot more unpacking to be done with this. The reason there's not whole chapters to unpack this is this idea that listen, just avoid it entirely. Accept the free grace, the good gift of His salvation forever, and then you don't have to worry about that. I'll come back to this in a minute. There are several passages that reference it, and I'll point out one of them in a moment. There's where we are. Jesus has made this statement. He has proclaimed this greater condemnation on the scribes. And then I think we get a little gap here. And verse 21, it says, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts in the offering box. Now, you don't know this. I didn't know this. But this is telling us that Jesus has probably changed locations in the temple. So he's probably debating in the men's section, but the treasury is in the women's section of the temple. And so the treasury, I think we've got some pictures, if we can pull those up. The treasury, there were 13 little passageways, or little archways that were in this section that people could put money in. This picture is a little bit wrong, though, because we know from later writings that at least probably at the time of Jesus, those boxes actually looked like this. You can actually looked more like this, with this kind of brass trumpet-shaped funnel at the top, or a bronze funnel to guide the money into the boxes. So Jesus, probably coming down from some of the emotions of all this debate, he's sitting in the women's area of the temple court now. I think he probably is avoiding some of the religious leaders at this point. And now he's sitting and watching people, honestly, from Jesus' perspective, at their worst. You see, it's understood that let me just show you. Those bronze funnels had an interesting side effect in the way that they are made. So what happens is when you have something made out of brass or bronze like this, or metallic, and you come along and someone reaches inside and throws their money in, makes a lot of noise. And so the longer that goes on, the stream of money that's going into it, people will start looking up like, wow, who is that guy? As the guy is making more and more, dumping out wads of money, and people are like, wow, that guy's, and with great pride and with great arrogance, it seems that this is probably how this was done, is that people would drop it in from as far a distance as they could get away with, throwing them in, making lots of noise, and letting it drag on for a long time. People didn't bring in dollar bills, they brought in pennies, so that it would sound like a whole lot, right? And so this is what's going on in the temple, and you can imagine Jesus just hating this. I picture Jesus sitting there with a splitting headache after dealing with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, and he's sitting there, and all that he can hear is the clanging of this gong and the banging of this cymbal as people are throwing money into this heading and probably watching them at their worst, him rolling his eyes or closing his eyes as people dump their coins in with pride. Now, then something very special happens. I think God, the Father, gives a gift to his Son. Jesus has got to be tired and infuriated. He's exhausted. He's worn out. And what happens now is that Jesus there, here's how I would direct it. If I was Dallas Jenkins. Dallas, if you're watching, you can use this. Go right ahead. So I picture Jesus sitting there in the temple, his eyes kind of glazed over, maybe half asleep, just worn out, dealing with these stubborn, hard-hearted people. Jesus sitting there, and when something catches his attention and it draws him up to his feet, right? It says in verse 2, and he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. You've got the little copper coin. You got your little coins down here, right? That's the little example, just 2 little tiny coins. Now, notice, this is one of those widows that we were just talking about. It's a storytelling perspective. It can't be an accident that Luke includes this story of a widow right after referencing widows whose lives have been destroyed by the religious leaders. No nice clothes, no significance, no importance, just 2 what are called mites. Now, denarius, you know about, we talked about that last week or 2 weeks ago. A denarius is 1 day's labor. It's the coin you get for working 1 full day. A mite is 1/64th of that. 7 minutes of labor or so. Now, granted, she has 2 of them, so there is that, right? I'm kidding. It would cost more to count them than they are worth. And in this, Jesus, for the first time maybe this whole day, is moved. I picture tears filling in his eyes as he's standing there watching this woman drop in her 2 little pennies and is shuffling off. And the disciples standing around and others going like, what just happened? Something's happened. What just happened? With tears in his eyes, as God the Father, I think, has reminded his Son, there is a remnant of people who are faithful to me. There are people who still look to me and trust in me. All hope is not lost in Israel. With tears in his eyes, he turns and says to his disciples, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. Now again, as a word guy, looking this up, I was curious, is this actually a relative term? And it is. It's not just she put in a lot. The two words are the word for more or much and all the people. It's a word that means all the people, all the crowd, everyone. And I think Jesus isn't just saying she put in more than each of them. He is literally saying she put in more than all of them. Everyone else who we've been sitting here as they dumped money in here, and she outgave them all. Now this is wild. He says, for they contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. Think about this for a second. He is measuring, not based on the number. You can imagine the disciples going, that wasn't more. I hate to bring it to you, Jesus. It wasn't. You imagine Judas going like, listen, you're not even close. Like that was certainly not more. Jesus knows it's more because Jesus is gifted by the Holy Spirit in this moment with supernatural knowledge that a mere human could not have. Jesus somehow miraculously knows her net worth. And he knows what she just put in represents approximately 100% of her worth. That's what she put in. She has essentially nothing, and she gave it all. How do you think her judgment will go? Which would you rather be in judgment? The scribes or the widow? We are meant to look at this passage and feel sorry for the scribes, for the judgment they will face, and hope that we can face a judgment like she does. When she faces judgment someday, I think some part of us would love nothing more than to then say, and when she went back to her house, she found that her coffee was full of gold coins. Or she tripped over a branch and it broke open and there was a bunch of silver in it. We would love that. And you know what we would do with that immediately? We would turn that into a formula. We would go, oh, so the trick is, here's how I manipulate God into giving me a lot of money, is this. I love, though I also hate, that he doesn't let us know what happens to this widow. Does she go home and starve? I can't imagine that that's what happens, and yet we don't know because the point he's making is she threw herself fully on her trust in Almighty God to take care of her in the next moments. And we're supposed to consider her judgment. The passage I promised to reference a second ago, 2 Corinthians 5:10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Most theologians, biblical theologians, will say there are probably two aspects to judgment. The first one, and the one that matters most, is the pass-fail. It is the I know you, I don't know you. It is the sheep, goats, wheat, tares judgment. If you know him, his righteousness, his name is our righteousness. We are covered in his righteousness. If you don't know him, all you have is your own righteousness, and good luck with that. If you know yourself at all, you know that's not going to get you far. However, it may get you something, because then what will happen in judgment is that each one of us will then be judged based on what we've done. And there you will have a continuum all the way from the absolute worst, who are all agreement they probably should face some type of punishment, to the absolute best, that we would go like, oh, this person deserves some kind of amazing glorification, whatever that is. And the widow may be near the top. Wouldn't surprise me if she's near the top of that pile whenever that happens. Now, the pass-fail in the middle, this is the one that really matters. And he offers that one to us as a free gift. Which one do you want? Do you know me or not? One vital piece of this judgment is apparently that to whom much is given, much is required. She had nothing, and she gave it. They had everything, and they hoard it. So how about us? Do we have much? Or do we have little? Apparently in the kingdom, it is 100% absolutely insignificant and meaningless how much we have. What matters is how faithfully we live. So what do we do with it? This, guys, has been the theme of our youth talks recently. It was certainly the theme of our men's weekend, of the identity conversation with church, and these passages in Luke. This is a theme that has shown up over and over again. I suspect that's the reason for that God is calling us to this. It's so easy for us as congregational Christians or cultural Christians to go, well, I'm pretty much Christian, or I'm largely Christian, or listen, I do a lot. I don't know what that is. What I would tell you is, this is what I believe the call is. You're like, Chris, you saying I'm supposed to empty out all my bank accounts and give it to the church or give it to a nonprofit or whatever? Like, only if God's telling you to do that. And by the way, if God's telling you to do that, I recommend you do it. I don't think that's a general calling on all of us. I think the general calling on all of us is, you cannot be my disciple unless you forsake everything. So if there's anything that in your heart you go, nope, that one's still mine. I'm not giving that up. This is my prerogative, my anger, my resentment, my unforgiveness, my addiction, my relationships, and by the way, these are good things and bad things. All of them, do we set them before God and say they're His, not mine? What are we holding back is the question. And it's going to continue to come up all the way up until Jesus' crucifixion. We're going to continue to see His message of all in. So that's my calling and encouragement to us today. So if you will, stand. I hope you're asking yourself, what am I holding back? What do I keep for myself? What am I not forsaking for His name? What have I decided, nope, I get this, my way's better than His way. We're going to go with my way. In this time of invitation, if you've got anything at all that you want someone to pray with you about, we've got people up here, prayer leaders and ministers who would love to pray with you about anything. If you've never put your faith in Jesus Christ, if you've never accepted that free gift, they'd love nothing more than to have that time to talk with you and pray with you. And so would I. Any of us would. Probably a lot of people in the room would be happy to do so. If you're a Christian and you can look at your life and see there are things in your life, whatever they happen to be, the range that you've said, no, this one I'm holding on to. This is going to be mine. I'm not giving this up. Now, we're terrible at it, and I know that. We're all terrible at it. We give it away and we take it back, and we give it away and we take it back. It's a lifetime experience of learning to give it up and let it go. But that's the encouragement I would have for all of us, whatever those happen to be. You may need to come pray. And also, by the way, if you've been visiting our church and you've been going through the welcome home process and you're ready to come and join this dysfunctional family, we would love to have you do that as well this morning. You probably already know you're coming if that's you, but we'd love to have that as well during this time. Let me read to you from another passage in Luke where Jesus unpacks this idea. In Luke chapter 12, here's what He said. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The very words of God.